Selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, SSRIs, are the most widely prescribed antidepressants in many countries. These drugs increase levels of neurotransmitter serotonin by limiting its reabsorption into the presynaptic cell, thus increasing the level of serotonin available to bind to postsynaptic receptors. Despite being the main medicine prescribed for a disease which afflicts more than 300 million people worldwide, the efficacy of SSRIs remain disputed. Around one-third don't actually get better with treatment. Even among those who do recover, relapse rates are high with many side effects including weight gain, sexual dysfunction, and even suicidal thoughts. Worst of all, users feel emotionally shut down. They feel blunted and disconnected emotionally. Despite all this, SSRIs remain our best bet against this crippling disease because no new classes of drugs have emerged for the past 3 decades. Well, until now. Psychedelics. The term psychedelics is derived from Greek words, psycho referring to the soul and the mind, delics meaning to manifest, essentially translating to soul manifesting, referring to the ability of psychedelics to access the soul and develop unused potential of the human mind. These are powerful hallucinogens that can alter perception, mood, and numerous connective processes by binding to serotonin receptors. They include compounds such as LSD and psilocybin, which is also more commonly known as magic mushrooms. So recent research have demonstrated the strong and durable benefits of psychedelics for treatment of a variety of mental illnesses. Large studies have shown that a single dose of these substances significantly reduced depression in patients with treatment-resistant depression and has even improved the conditions of those with anxiety. More importantly, they are neither toxic nor addictive, and they do not dull the senses. On the contrary, sensory perception is being intensified and attention is aroused. So given their therapeutic utility, there are a few questions that we are interested in. Firstly, what kind of interactions they have with neuronal receptors? Secondly, how do psychedelic-assisted therapies actually improve mental health? Before we talk about the molecular mechanisms of psychedelics, let's analyze their structures. Psychedelics have structures similar to serotonin, a neurotransmitter which regulates mood and sleep. As such, they function by binding to serotonin receptors, specifically receptor type 2A. But if all of them target the same receptor, why does LSD cause a psychedelic experience but not serotonin? Well, according to a study done by Dr. Daniel Wecker last year, different structures actually cause the receptor to be activated differently. When an agonist binds to the 5-HT receptor, it interacts with the various helices of the receptor, and this results in conformational changes of the receptor. It is these very small conformational changes in the serotonin receptor that will determine the kind of signal transduction pathway it will activate. So endogenous agonists like serotonin are able to adopt more than one receptor conformation, which allows it to activate both the G protein pathway as well as the beta-arrestin pathway. So the G protein activates the neuron electrically, while the beta-arrestin protein is involved in the termination of the G protein signal and promotion of the endogenesis of the receptor, recycling it for new binding. But more interestingly is that the beta-arrestin also has its own signal transduction pathway, which researchers are still not exactly sure what it does. So where does this lead to with LSD? Well, here's a catch. Some compounds can stabilize a distinct receptor conformation, thereby they preferentially activate a specific signal transduction pathway. So this phenomenon is also termed functional selectivity. In this case, LSD adopts a constrained conformation in the binding site which cannot switch over readily to alternate conformational states. This causes it to selectively stimulate the beta-arrestin pathway, which researchers believe to be responsible for the psychedelic trip. Another major breakthrough in the study of the 5-HT2A receptor is that when LSD binds, not only does the conformation of the receptor shift towards the beta-arrestin pathway, it also changes such that a structure called the extracellular loop 2 actually forms a lead over LSD molecule, effectively closing it inside the receptor. So this lead closing is optimized by the diethyl imide group in the LSD, which is absent in the serotonin. This accounts for slower dissociation rates and longer active duration, which, as mentioned earlier, can sometimes last up to 12 hours. So now, let's look at the bigger picture, the serotonergic system. The serotonergic system has long been implicated in anxiety and depressive disorder. Given its complexity, the activation of the serotonin type 2A receptor will certainly have far-reaching consequences on other pathways such as the alteration of the prefrontal glutamatergic signaling. But the exact neurobiology behind this system remains speculative. In his paper on this, David Nutt and his team propose a bipartite system in which they suggest that there are two different serotonergic pathways involved in responding to stress. A passive coping pathway which improves the endurance of stress, and an active coping pathway which improves the ability to identify and thus overcome the source of stress. So the first pathway involves receptor type 1A, which is believed to dominate under normal conditions. So under high stress conditions, when serotonin release is elevated, the 5-HT2A receptor signaling would serve as a more important role, and this is characterized by brain plasticity. So this serves to facilitate major changes and the ability to adapt in conditions of extreme adversity. Let's look at this in closer detail. The 5-HT1A receptors are highly expressed in the temporal lobe regions, particularly in the hippocampus. So these are brain regions which regulate stress and emotion in the brain circuitry, which we call the limbic circuitry. SSRI and other conventional antidepressants actually act on receptor type 1A directly or indirectly to decrease the limbic responsivity. This causes feelings such as anxiety and aggression to be suppressed, and it in turn leads to increased tolerance of stress. Thus, the symptoms of depression are alleviated. So, on the other hand, regarding receptor type 2A, so these are receptors targeted by psychedelics, and they are predominantly expressed in high-level cortex regions, particularly in the pyramidal neurons of the cortical layer 5. These are cortical regions which are involved in higher psychological functions such as thought process, the concept of self. So they belong to this network which we call the default mode network. What exactly is the default mode network? You may have heard of these terms being thrown around in many articles on psychedelics. So the default mode network is a set of brain regions that are active in the background even during passive rest and even when our minds are wandering. So it's supposedly the neurobiological basis of the concept of self. So it allows us to differentiate between ourselves and the surrounding. As such, this network has been hypothesized to be relevant to disorders including schizophrenia, where patients suffer from the incoherent self-expression, and also in depression and anxiety, where patients show increased self-focus and unnecessary obsession with certain aspects of self. So here's the interesting bit. When the brain is under the influence of psilocybin, the network actually nearly shuts down. So this downregulation of the default mode network is why users of LSD or psilocybin often report dissolution of ego, loss of sense of self. With lowered ego functioning, previously unconscious thoughts or deep emotions are now suddenly popping up all at once, because brain regions that generally don't communicate are suddenly striking up conversations. As such, psychedelics, etc. are able to increase the ability of cortex to adapt and react to stress. And we can summarize this in this picture. Doctors believe that psychedelics treat the cause of depression rather than just suppressing the symptoms, which is what makes them more effective.